Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Net Zero's Ugly Ideology and Heidegger's Green Philosophy. O beware, my lord, of net zero. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. Iago to Othello, slightly adapted. I never saw a man who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue which prisoners call the sky, and at every drifting cloud that went with sails of silver by. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. Oscar Wilde, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. Hi everybody, and here you can see we have everybody's favourite Doom Goblin, and below another different type of Doom Goblin from a more philosophical perspective. So the first you will recognise as Greta Thunberg. How dare you! I can't do the voice properly, obviously. That was my best effort. And then you've got below her, Heidegger wrote his most famous book, for those not familiar with his work, was Sein und Zeit in 1927, which in English is Being and Time. I just like saying it in German. And then he did a famous essay, which I'm going to refer to different bits of his work. But in this video, I'll refer mostly to a paper he did called an essay called The Question Concerning Technology from 1954. And what I want to do is I'm just using Greta Thunberg as the exemplum of net zero ideologists, the more dogmatic, and play off against the concept of net zero and what green activism, the tactics it uses by focusing upon art and throwing super art, I'll give you examples of, but also the way in which it promotes, inverted commas, clean technology. And I'm going to be questioning that and using Heidegger's philosophy, particularly the essay, The Question Concerning Technology. I'm going to ask to what extent is green net zero ideology actually partaking of exactly the same, if not exactly the same underlying essential logic as industrial technology and capitalism that, according to green ideology, is laying waste to the whole ecology. So I'll be giving you examples of how so-called green technology isn't exactly a beautiful vision. So that's why I'm calling it an ugly ideology. And the quote, apologies for adapting the green-eyed monster, but I'm using that quote from Othello, the green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on, as an example of something that uses its own essence to feed upon. And I think this is what green ideology does. It purports to be looking after the planet when in fact it arguably either does harm, as I'll be showing, but also I'm sure everyone's familiar with the more virtue signaling aspects. So Greta Thunberg can stand there and say, how dare you? I'm sure the leaders of both India and China, which are by far the biggest polluters on the planet, have zero interest in net zero. So it's performative. It's not going to achieve anything at all. And I'll be looking at that performative aspect as well. But the Othello quote reminds me, just as a complete, on a complete tangent, I think it's also in Act 3, Scene 3, where that quote came from, but there's my favourite Shakespeare quote of all time, where Othello says, what was it? I had rather be a toad and live upon the vapour of a dungeon than keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses, which I'd rather be a toad is one of my go-to phrases these days. But on that non-beautiful, ugly note, I'm just going to give you a few examples of the Just Stop Oil antics. This painting that they've glued themselves to is Peach Trees Blossom by Vincent van Gogh. And I think this was the Courtauld Gallery in London. I think it was about 2022. And this is the painting, just, non-disturbed by orange t-shirt wearing dogmatists. And I'll be developing ideas based upon the scenic nature of art, especially I'll be using Monet, Pissarro, Camille Pissarro, and Van Gogh's work just to show you counterposing it to green technology to see it, a bit of a rhetorical question, but which one is more beautiful? So this was from an article in National Geographic. The headline was "Throwing Soup at Van Gogh: Why Climate Activists Are Targeting Art," and the tagline was, "By tossing paint and food on the glass exterior, protecting famous paintings." Well, I'd point out they don't always have the glass. They do now probably, but they never used to. So some paintings have actually been damaged. Activists say they're conveying a powerful message. Art cannot exist on a destroyed planet, hence they're destroying it. So this was Van Gogh's, I think the full title was Still Life Vase with 15 Sunflowers, or as our North American chums would say, vase. It's 1888. And this was after the Heinz tomato soup brigade have done their best or worst. And this is John Constable, the Haywain from 1821. And what they've done here, if it's not clear, apart from, this insatiable need to glue themselves everywhere, they've put posters depicting the Haywain with concrete roads and planes in the sky. So on top of the original, they've put this dystopian image. And what I'm going to argue as the video progresses is that this is their idea of a dystopian future, when actually I don't think their representation of the Haywain is much different to the actual practical effects of the green technologies they're all in favour of in order to promote net zero. So this is June Morning at Pontoise by Camille Pissarro from 1873. And I will definitely in future, I've got a video planned on, this will scare everybody off, but Camille Pissarro had a thing about, or maybe I just noticed it, he had a thing about roads, as you can see here. And I'm pretty certain I'll do a video just on roads disappearing into the distance, which will probably get about 7 people watching, but hey ho. But this is what I think the world looks like when the green activists, net zero, comes to town. And if you think that's exaggerating, I'm now going to show you a series of images from the real world. Yeah, I'll explain more as we go along, but it would be interesting to get comments in the feedback section about, there is something about Pissarro, the way he does roads going off to the horizon line. This is like mid-range for me, in the sense, in some of his paintings, I get this visceral feeling, almost, in your stomach, a sense of spatial movement disappearing into the distance. You almost feel drawn into the painting, and maybe it's a sign of advancing senility. I need to get checked out at the doctor's, but it would be interesting if anyone else relates to that. But I'll give you examples of that as we go along. So this is a Monet, 1871. Windmills, and forgive any Dutch people, but Haldesbroek, Zandam, or Zandam, reminds me of Van Damme. But Haldesbroek, or something like that. It's impossible to pronounce Dutch, I find, so apologies for my Philistinism. But this is 1871. It's a beautiful portrayal of windmill power, and one of the themes that Heidegger addresses, as we'll see shortly, is the distinction to be made between human creations coexisting with nature and human creations in the form of advanced technology that, to use his phrase, challenges reality and challenges nature. And he uses various phrases to convey this notion of challenging rather than coexisting with. So the point being, there's not much threat to the environment through these wooden windmills. They're using the wind, but they're not harming or the overall environment. And you might miss it, but there's a milkmaid coming over the humped back bridge. But now we go, this is, I forgot where, this is Western France. So a beautiful idyllic country church. And let's throw in a couple of wind turbines. And I think what you don't obviously get from the pictures is the thrumming sound of these like horse flies on steroids. This is Stirling Castle in Scotland, looking particularly picturesque. And here we are once the wind turbines have been introduced. And it will be interesting, apart from the abuse I'll get from the net zero zealots, but it would be interesting. There are various online articles and so on that actually portray pictures like this and use them as an example of how beautiful wind farms are. So maybe I'm just out on a complete limb, and I find these really ugly and really horrible and really intrusive and really destructive of the natural environment aesthetically, and I'm guessing it's not much fun if you're a bird, or the notion that any wildlife could, exist under these things is for the bird, so to speak. It's horrendous. Ah, dear. And for some people, these are beautiful. I could just keep showing you. There's something, it's like watching a car crash rubbernecking. It's something morbidly fascinating about watching the destruction of nature by these technologies that are supposed to be saving it. Right, so as an introduction, I'm not going to do a lot on Heidegger's philosophy because it's, I think, very difficult. I wrote a book I co-authored a book with a colleague in America called, what was it, Heidegger and the Media. So I'm up on my Heidegger, but even I, having been immersed in it, understand, I think for most non-trained philosophical philosophers, it's difficult stuff. And even Sein und Zeit was difficult and verbose and wordy and weird language he uses, but relatively, for Heidegger, analytical. And then in his later work, the question concerning technology I'm going to quote is actually one of his more accessible pieces. But right towards the end of his life, he got really woo-woo. He talked about the fourfold, and he got quite mystical in his old age. But interestingly, very much into the power of poetry as an insight into the human condition. So in future, maybe look at that. But one of his key ideas was this notion of the pre-Socratics. So I won't bore you with all the details, but one of his arguments was that Western philosophy went wrong with Plato. It began to go wrong with this preference for the abstract and the notion of ideal forms. Whereas the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus would be one perfect example. The pre-Socratics, those philosophers that were writing and teaching before Socrates, the idea is that they believed that the world was essentially made of flux. So Heraclitus famously said, you can't step in the same river twice. And I think the legend is one of his students said not even once, meaning the idea is that a river's always changing. So it's never the same river the second time. And I think his clever, smart-ass student was trying to say, even if you stood in the one river, it's flowing past you. So it's not really the same river even then. But this notion of life as flux and motion is something that interested Heidegger immensely. So then he tries to explain concepts of experience using this phenomenological, existential mishmash. But he has these key ideas that I'll just very briefly introduce. notions of bringing forth, unconcealment, Dasein. Dasein is, in German, it literally means the being. Apparently, I'm not a German expert whatsoever, but in German they use prepositional formations much more than in English. So Dasein, the being. It's an interesting. There's movement. There's the notion of you don't just exist statically. It goes to this notion of life as flux and motion. The idea is that Dasein, it's the being. There's this, you're thrown into the world, and there's movement and bringing forth and unconcealment. They're complex ideas in Heidegger. Basically, it's about, in nature, things get revealed to us, or we experience as human beings, we experience life. Things reveal themselves to us, they're brought forth. And he contrasts that with phrases like Gestell, enfrainment, which is a much more technological approach to life, where things aren't brought forth organically or naturally. I used the word earlier, challenged forth. It's in a much more rigorous, systematic, and non-organic way. So I'll try and give you visual examples of these quite abstract terms. And then there's physis and poesis, these ideas that physis is, for example, a flower, the blossom coming out and unfurling. That would be the creation within nature of what's inherent in nature. A caterpillar becoming a butterfly. These are acts of creation that are integral to how nature works. They're inherent properties of revealing, bringing forth, unconcealment, to use these other phrases. Whereas poesis is what a artist or a craftsperson would do. They create things through their mastery of their art form. So these are the type of notions that he wants to contrast with a technological approach to the world. And it's interesting in this context, techne, the Greek root of the word for technology, originally it meant to craft something. And Heidegger relates techne to this notion of bringing forth versus enfrainment, challenging forth the much more systematic, oppressive features of technology. So it's quite ironic that the word technology is based upon something that technology has largely replaced. And then I'm going to argue using artistic examples, this idea of Gelassenheit. It's letting be, releasement, calm, abandonment to revealing. It sounds all Eastern, mystical, Buddhist-like almost. But it's the idea of letting yourself experience the world naturally, as opposed to experiencing the world through technological reproductions. And maybe at a future date I could hope to do something on the links I see between Heidegger and Jean Baudrillard and his ideas of the idea that we live in a matrix, we live in this world of simulation, we live in a world in which it's increasingly impossible to distinguish between the reproduction and any notion of an original reality. So all of this would be related. But just to start introducing the visual images now, this is from a late essay he did called Building, Dwelling, Thinking. Dwelling and building are related as end and means. However, as long as this is all we have in mind, we take dwelling and building as two separate activities, an idea that has something correct in it. Yet at the same time, by the means-end schema, we block our view of the essential relations. For building is not merely a means and a way toward dwelling. To build is in itself already to dwell. Who tells us this? Who gives us a standard at all by which we can take the measure of the nature of dwelling and building? And if there's any interest in the comments, this might be enough to put you off Heidegger. I did say that towards the end he gets quite mystical and woo-woo. But he implies it when he talks about an idea that has something correct in it. I think an essential part of Heidegger's work is he distinguishes between what's correct and what's true. So something can be correct, but it's not necessarily true at a deeper level. And that's what he uses to talk about the relationship between building and dwelling and how ideally the two ideas are combined. So rather than, I'll give you examples in a second of buildings that are shell-like, inorganic, technologically mass-produced, that are not particularly friendly to human natural dwelling. So it's just a very basic example of a quite complex distinction he makes in this whole essay, which I won't have time to do today. So this is just a very practical artistic example of dwelling and its relationship with building. Vincent van Gogh, this is a village street in Auvers, 1890. And I'll overuse the word organic, but it strikes me as potentially the best one to use. You can see how, at least the way Van Gogh presents it, the buildings, the walls, the vegetation, you can see the sloping roof of the building on the right, look, is the colour of grass. That could be moss, could be anything. But the earthy brown of the roof of the buildings on the left, the way everything merges in, the way the buildings look ramshackle, the staircases, stone staircases at angles, it's not very machine-like. It's not very technologically looking. And this would be an example of the real world. And this is York. It's known as York Shambles in the fine county of Yorkshire. And these are obviously the original beautiful buildings that lean over into the street. I contrast that. I'm beginning to give examples now of the technological, the enframed, what Heidegger referred to with the phrase Gestell. This is Disney's Celebration Town in Florida. And I hope you could see how that's distinctly different from both the York Shambles and the Van Gogh painting of Auvers. And this is Wisconsin, I believe. On Alaska, I think it is. And I'm showing it because it just epitomizes the notion of a strip mall in my mind, in the sense that, again, these are hardly organically the shops that have grown up organically. They've been designed in this, quite artificial looking building. There's the rigid geometry of the car parking spaces, and God forbid that anyone should have to walk anywhere, so the car parking spaces are as physically close to the shops as possible. You can go and get your huge meal and then waddle back to the car, and you can see the freeway behind. So everything's designed for the convenience of transportation in a technological way. And this is housing. And the point here being that, this isn't cheap housing necessarily, but you can see the cookie cutter type nature of the housing. It's not Van Gogh's image, that's for sure. I think this might be Pennsylvania from memory. And now this is Sun City, Arizona. So the idea is that the central facilities, like shops and cinema and stuff, are in the middle, and there's this ever radiating concentric circles of elderly residents. This is their retirement home environment. And I show you this because I'm trying to illustrate the difference between what I would call an organic experience and a more manufactured experience. So this is a bar in a strip mall, and I think I went somewhere in Long Island, was it? A bar in a strip mall, and as a British person, just used to what I would call authentic, genuine pubs, this was a really alienating, weird experience. Because most good British pubs have been there, not for much longer probably, the way they're being got rid of. But for centuries, pubs have been there and had the same basic role. This would be another example. I don't mean to pick on Alex's. I'm sure they're very nice people in there. But that does not strike me as a particularly... it's not a pub, it's a bar, but it's not a bar or pub built for dwelling in the Heideggerian sense, I wouldn't suggest. And it always disturbs me when there are massive cars and parking spaces right outside the bar. Yeah, like, there's no drink driving going to go on near there, is there? And then, just as contrast, I had to stop myself because I originally, for this video, had a load of images from the Philharmonic pub that in a different video I've done before. I've just rambled on about for hours on end because I love it. But this is the Bear and Billet in Chester, which isn't very far from me. And I need to go back, but I used to play backgammon here once a month. And so this is a fully functioning pub. But I hope you would appreciate the aesthetic difference. And I understand, before people shout at me, you can't all go to a 17th century pub as your local. But I'm just making the point, this is a wonderful, wonderful pub, but it's not that unusual, to paraphrase Tom Jones, in terms of British pubs. There are many like this, if not as good as this, still, authentic. So it's 1664, you can see from the window case. And I'm contrasting that because I don't want to be accused of picking on North America. These are images from, I'm pretty sure this was a bar in Edinburgh, which has its own historic pubs, but they've imitated a Boston Irish sports bar in this weird... And if you think about it, a Boston Irish sports bar is a simulated imitation version of what used to be a real Irish bar that didn't have sports bars per se, modern bars. And increasingly, if you go to Dublin, you'll see more pubs like this, imitating the imitation of the original that the Boston sports bar sought to emulate. So the so-called original Dublin bar will look increasingly like the simulated Irish imitation of the original Dublin bar. And that should all make perfect sense. And there's no need in somewhere like Edinburgh that's full of historic bars. This is an example of when you live in a technologically inframed Gestalt type mentality, these are the type of outcomes. So this fake Irishness that can be made to order. And why I'm showing you all this, you might, well, what's this got to do with net zero? I hear you shout at me. So before I lose you completely, the reason is this is how your own cultural life... So it's easy for me to show you pictures of wind farms on hills behind Stirling Castle, and I'll be showing you much more destructive, horrible, ugly images of net zero, so-called clean energy technologies. But ultimately, these images, this is the cultural aspect of what technology also does to nature. I'm trying to show to what levels it permeates our whole environment, not just the natural environment, also the environment that we've created for ourselves. So it's back to this thing, the difference between the symbiosis between dwelling and building, or just building for technological, aesthetic reasons. So this would be a perfect example. This is McCafferty's Irish bar. And its interpretation of an Irish bar, apparently, is how much junk and crap you can hang from a ceiling. But the kicker here is, this McCafferty's Irish bar is actually to be found in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, that famous Irish drinking hole. So the way in which the simulation, as Baudrillard would call it, doesn't need any natural environment. It can just be plonked down anywhere in the world. So the question for those in the tech sector and the problem concerning technology is then, how does one ensure that one is creating without determining? How does one let the world present itself through modern technology rather than determining how and for what it appears? So I'm quoting here from this Justin Richards paper where he analyses the question of technology essay, and shortly I'll give you quotes from the actual essay itself. But I think he summarises quite nicely the actual key issue. How does one ensure that one is creating without determining? How does one let the world present itself through modern technology rather than determining how and for what it appears? So I think he's using the word determining. You may have heard the phrase technological determinism, the notion that if you're not careful, technology can determine how we live our lives. And there's most academic studies, my background in my PhD was all about this. There's a bias and an ideology that's always geared towards saying, no, human beings ultimately shape technology. There's no real thing of technological determinism. And I would question that. I think Heidegger, Jean Baudrillard, Marshall McLuhan, there are various thinkers who point out the minute you start engaging with technology, and I'll explain as we go along shortly, the minute you start using technology, the technology affects how you interact with the world around you in direct but also indirect ways. It's not always, you're not always totally conscious of the subliminal effects technology can have. So the problem for most human beings concerns how to authentically appropriate technology such that it does not extend its technologization into areas that dehumanize. Not all Not all technologization is necessarily bad. A hammer and a pencil both technologize the user every bit as much as a computer keyboard does. And that will be explained in the next slide because that might sound a bit provocative. But I just wanted to highlight the problem, because I think this relates to net zero and green technologies and the ideology behind it. The problem for most human beings concerns how to authentically appropriate technology such that it does not extend its technologization into areas that dehumanize. The examples I gave you of the pubs, the theme pubs, the pubs in strip malls, the bars that don't look like good old traditional pubs, I'm suggesting that's a form of how a technological attitude or ideology can infect how we live our lives on a day-to-day dwelling versus building interaction. So that's at the cultural level. They're the pictures I showed you of the bars and the pubs. But also the problem for most human beings concerns how to authentically appropriate technology such that it does not extend its technologization into areas that dehumanize. I would also extend that argument about the pubs versus the bars and strip malls to the wind farms on the hills, because it's this extension of technologization into areas that dehumanize. Not just dehumanize, denatures the nature that you're supposed to be protecting by using the wind farms. But this concept of the hammer and a pencil is interesting. When he says they both technologize the user every bit as much as a computer keyboard does, he's saying even though they're basic technologies, you use a hammer and a pencil that affects how you interact with the world because you're either trying to bang a nail or you're trying to write something. So writing something, banging a nail, they're technologically mediated ways of interacting with the world just as much as using a keyboard is. But, and it's a big but, there's a pop song about that, and I cannot lie. But the keyboard notion arguably takes it to put myself off now. It takes it to a stage further. Quickly moving on. A hammer extends the authentic action of human swinging and grasping, while a nail gun harnesses the same phenomenon but more forcefully pulls the user into a specific mode of interaction. A pencil forces one to engage in a certain type of grasping that we must learn, just like we have to learn to tap the keys on a keyboard. But the pencil imitates the fluidity of spoken language more than the seemingly random tapping away at keys. So this, I think it's a useful illustration or example he gives here, Justin Richards. The idea that the hammer is quite authentic because it relates to your natural body as you try and it extends your innate ability to use your arm in a specific way, but the nail gun takes it much further in a more dehumanizing, alienating way, so it more forcefully pulls the user into a specific mode of interaction. So with a hammer, there's the phrase, when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It is possible to go around wanting to hit everything with a hammer, but your ability to control your actions, your ability to be addicted like you would be with a mobile phone, is much less the minute you start using a nail gun. So you see people constructing roofs really quickly using a nail gun. And yes, it's efficient, but it takes away the skill and the artistry of a good carpenter. And then a pencil forces one to engage in a certain type of grasping that we must learn. The pencil imitates the fluidity of spoken language. And when I was teaching, I hated the way the university authorities just let computers, laptops into the lecture theatre, because it's just so obvious that when you write with a pencil or a pen, when you write handwritten notes, they mean more when you read them later. And there's been studies to prove this. And even when you read a book, the people who, oh God, I don't want to get upset the people who use Kindles, but if you're reading a book with a pencil, you can highlight really quickly, you can write notes to yourself. And yes, you can do it with a Kindle, but it's just, trust me, it's not the same. Getting all emotional now. It's no accident that we think a million monkeys with typewriters would eventually write Shakespeare by accident, but make no similar expectation in regards to a million monkeys with pencils. It's quite an interesting idea, that. Because the idea is that the monkey brain, allegedly, I don't want to be accused of discriminating against monkeys, but the monkey brain is random, it's arbitrary. And when you link it with a keyboard, there's the notion of, with enough time, anything is possible. But a pencil's much more personal, a pencil's much more subjective. So we don't make the same association. Heidegger instead advocates responsibility characterized by starting something on its way, which lets the thing come into presence, to bring forth an occasion. In order to bring forth, one brings into unconcealment that which is concealed, bringing forth as a revealing. And this is where this is why I'm only going to show you a bit of Heidegger, because it does get really complicated and it's quite circumlocutory. So it's not just in Richard's writing in a pretentious way. This is how Heidegger writes. But the language is trying to convey the idea that rather than a nail gun interacting with reality in a really forceful, determining way, my example of the carpenter can choose which tool to use. The carpenter knows a good piece of wood. A carpenter uses their judgment, will choose. The nail gun, not so much. Technology is a mode of revealing that reveals what does not bring itself into appearance. Technology makes things. Heidegger calls our attention towards a technology that does not proceed from out of the will to mastery. Poiesis, the process which makes works of art. So this is one of the key themes of this whole channel. Poiesis, the human creativity. I think there's a missing I in poiesis there, apologies. I think it from memory. I don't want to do what's his name, the American vice president who misspelled potatoes. But I think it's Poiesis. I'm now trying to remember. You'll all be shouting in the comments what that guy's name was. It'll come to me and I'll blurt it out later like I've got Tourette's. Oh, I can see him in my mind's eye, but I just can't remember his name. The guy who couldn't spell potato. But this distinction Moving on, I need to control myself, these diversions. There, techne in its original form, this craftsmanship, this artistry, it stands in opposition to this technological mentality. And remember, just to re-emphasize, the technological mentality I'm describing, I'm saying it reveals itself in cultural forms like strip bars, not strip bars, that's something different, strip mall bars and real pubs. I would argue till the day I die, there's an authenticity in one, the latter, that's lacking in the former. But likewise, the art examples I'm about to show you are all about having a natural relationship to nature versus what technologies like wind farms or sun farms, they actually, in the guise of being ecologically green and all about net zero, actually partake of the same, if you ask me, the same underlying technological essence. So this is the landscape near Pontoise by Pissarro, 1872. And I like this one, mate, because it's the path leads away from you. But right in the middle or bottom, top third, however you want to look at the painting, the path then hits a natural barrier. And it's quite difficult to make out precisely because there's some shrubs, there's what looks like some fencing. So it goes off, it meanders off to the side and then goes off into the distance again, still not particularly clearly defined. But we'll see in the upcoming images, you'll see hints on the left. There's the brown. I just love this about Pissarro. It's the browns and the greens. He's obsessed about Earth, and in Heidegger's later work, there is part of the fourfold as the concept of the Earth, the sky. I think it's the divinities and mortals. But the notion of the sky and the Earth, it's always in Pissarro's paintings, or many of them. And this is the Route de Versailles, Rockencore, 1871. And this is the type of, this is where I need to be psychoanalyzed, because this gives me a visceral sense, this going off into the distance, the way he paints the roads. But there is technology in these paintings. In the previous painting, there was a hay wagon. There's a horse and cart. I almost said a heart and course. The horse and cart on the left, and the horses, and looks like a carriage in the distance. But the interaction of all these things, I keep saying I'd use the word organic, but it just all fits together. This isn't a challenging thought. And there's just this natural, slow disappearing off into the distance effect. And the way in which the ground and the sky join together at the horizon. The trees almost match the shape of the clouds. You know, everything's in unity. Again, that's just like, if you wanted to advertise plodding slowness, this wouldn't be a bad advertising campaign. And just you can see the gable end of the house in the distance, that submerged almost as part of the road. It doesn't look that dissimilar from the outlines of the trees. Everything's merged. And then he uses shadow. I think it's Sebastian in the comments keeps nagging me to do something on shade, which I will. But just the depths of these cypress trees. I'm useless with vegetation. The tunnel-like effect. The way in which the guy on the right, the nearest figure to us, merges with the tree trunks. This is landscape at Louveciennes, 1870 again. Pissarro. Pissarro is my guy. I like him. But again, on the right, the earthiness of the ground. Again, the distance. This is it's just called, in French, la route, so it'd just be the road in English from around about 1870. Again, it's Camille Pissarro. And I'm just showing you all these because I'm very shortly going to contrast them. This is my idea of Heidegger's green philosophy of the dwelling and the building all combining in a very natural, unforced, unchallenged. Gelassenheit almost is the spirit that comes out of these paintings. It's not Gestell, it's not challenging. It's the way the birds on the right, up in the sky, they're not too dissimilar to the leaves on the tree. There'll be birds in the trees. It's almost difficult to disentangle when you look. I told you another one. This is the Road to Versailles. Another one. He did a series at Louveciennes, and again it's Pissarro from 1870. And I love this one for the heaviness, on a snowy day. I don't think the inhabitants of Sun City, Arizona see too many days like this. This was 1869. It's all the same road to the Road to Versailles at Louveciennes. And they are coming to an end. I'm sorry, I'm just indulging myself. I don't know why, honestly, why I like Pissarro so much. He's like midway between Monet and Cézanne. This is, again, surprise you, the road at Louveciennes. Snow effect, 1869 to 70. But please do tell me in the comments if the distance going off into the horizon, the way he draws them, or I keep saying draw, the way he obviously does the initial drawing, then paints them. It's almost like blurred at the sides, as if you were going by in a car. There's that visual effect, but there's also this massive sense of slowness. Because all you can see are, plodding people. That might be my favourite. This is Monet this time. I just showed it to give a bit of further context because this is Road at Louveciennes, melting snow. But this is Monet, 1869 to 70. I'm a sucker for sunsets, miserable, the death of the day sunsets. I find bizarrely quite uplifting in a miserable sort of way. Right, so I want to quickly dive into the Heidegger. So this is from the question concerning technology. What is modern technology? It too is revealing. Only when we allow our attention to rest on this fundamental characteristic does that which is new in modern technology show itself to us. And yet, the revealing that holds sway throughout modern technology, sorry, that shouldn't say modem, that's a completely different kettle of fish, it does not unfold into a bringing forth in the sense of poiesis. The revealing that rules in modern technology is a challenging, so he's contrasting poiesis and challenging that modern technologies, you've got the artist, the craftsman who engages in poiesis, and you've got modern technology which creates a challenging, like the nail gun, herausfordern, which puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supply energy which can be extracted and stored as such. But does this not hold true for the old windmill as well? No, its sails do indeed turn in the wind. They are left entirely to the wind's blowing, and I've italicized and emboldened this because I think this is crucial. But the windmill does not unlock energy from the air currents in order to store it. So to bring all this back to the concept of net zero green ideology versus the green philosophy of Heidegger, this is the distinction Heidegger makes. This is what makes Heidegger a much more green thinker than Greta Thunberg could ever hope to be. Because Heidegger's proposing or describing a technology that leaves its sails do indeed turn in the wind. They are left entirely to the wind's blowing. So they're not interfering in the natural process. But the windmill does not unlock energy from the air current in order to store it. So this is, be interested if people have seen these, because I don't think they're as well known amongst Van Gogh's output. This is Van Gogh, 1886, Le Moulin de la Galette. And he just did a series, so this is at Montmartre, 1886. But I'm just using these as examples of what Heidegger's talking about. You don't see these as imposing on the horizon. They're made of rickety wood. They're not going to last forever. They look quite picturesque. Again, there's another Van Gogh, 1886. You know, the guy digging nearby, the birds above. If that was the industrial type of wind farm, those birds wouldn't be flying nearby like that. This is called Kitchen Gardens on Montmartre, 1887 Van Gogh. And this is, so the others are Van Gogh. This is Pissarro again. Windmill at Knock, I think it's called, in Belgium. But I think rickety is the way you describe these windmills. Almost looks like a dovecot, doesn't it? In contrast, a tract of land is challenged in the hauling out of coal and ore. The earth now reveals itself as a coal mining district, the soil as a mineral deposit. The field that the peasant formerly cultivated and set in order appears differently than it did when to set in order still meant to take care of and maintain. The work of the peasant does not challenge the soil of the field. In sowing grain, it places seed in the keeping of the forces of growth and watches over its increase. But meanwhile, even the cultivation of the field has come under the grip of another kind of setting in order, which sets upon nature. It sets upon it in the sense of challenging it. Agriculture is now the mechanized food industry. Air is now set upon to yield nitrogen, the earth to yield ore to yield uranium. For example, uranium is set up to yield atomic energy, which can be unleashed either for destructive or for peaceful purposes. But remember the phrase here that the peasant does not challenge the soil of the field. The way the paintings I've shown you by Pissarro, you see the soil in quite non-industrialized, carefully tilled way. The soil is a natural part of his paintings. You also see, peasants in the environment very naturally, and you'll see them in the forthcoming images as well, especially the sowing grain. So this is bizarrely one of my favorite paintings of all time, because not exactly dramatic or exotic or glamorous. Camille Pissarro, the cabbage field from 1873. I just love the atmosphere and as it recedes amidst the trees. And I've seen critics debate whether it's early morning or early evening, and I'm convinced it's early morning. It doesn't strike me as nighttime. Not nighttime. It doesn't strike me as dusk light conditions. I think it's dawn. But also the houses in the background, you can just see the tips of the roofs. And on the left-hand side, there's a chimney stack poking up. Again, this notion of the way in which nature and the buildings dwell amongst each other, to use Heidegger's phrase or idea. And there's something about the way that he draws the tree, or paints the tree on the left, the one nearest to us. I'm no art expert by any means, but if I ever had to identify a Pissarro, it's I can't think of many artists who paint a tree like that. There's something unique about it. And when I first looked at this painter, I always thought in the background. First of all, I thought, sorry, in the foreground, I always assumed that was a woman. But I think it's more. It probably is, but it's ambiguous, that because in the mid grounds, the person in blue leaning over, that a man or a woman? That could be a man digging, but it's a woman with a basket. And in the background, I initially always thought it was someone like a governess with two children by her side, and then you've got to look closely, but it looks like another woman with panniers to collect the cabbages or whatever. And on the right hand side, I'd imagined she was holding hands, but obviously it just looks now much more clearly that that's part of a tree trunk. But the way in which the tree trunk on the right is very similar to what I'm assuming is a pannier that she's carrying on her left shoulder, because that would match the figure in the foreground, the fact they're carrying something. But you see what I mean about the tree? It's similar to the cabbage field one. And remember the earlier quote from Heidegger about sowing, maintaining the field, not challenging the field. This is Pissarro from 1875. I'm not sure it's much of a commendation, but there aren't many painters who painted soil like Pissarro did. This is called Ploughed Land from 1874. This setting upon that challenges the energies of nature is an expediting, and in two ways. It expedites in that it unlocks and exposes, yet that expediting is always itself directed from the beginning toward furthering something else, i.e. toward driving on to the maximum yield at the minimum expense. So this is what technology does in opposition to those images of peasants. The coal that has been hauled out in some mining district has not been produced in order that it may simply be at hand somewhere or other. It is being stored, that is, it is on call, ready to deliver the sun's warmth that is stored in it. The sun's warmth is challenged forth for heat, which in turn is ordered to deliver steam, whose pressure turns the wheels that keep a factory running. So this is the last Pissarro image before I then show you. This is the, well, it's not totally the last, but one of the last. This is the idyllic rural view. The blurring of the people, the vegetation, the sky, the earth, everything in harmony. And here we have net zero's green technology. I feel like saying to Greta Thunberg, how dare you? This is the Mojave Desert in, I think it says an hour north of Los Angeles in Kern County, near Mojave, California. This is Ivanpah, I think it's called, solar electric generating system near Nipton in California. This weird solar mirror system. And this is $1 billion investment. And I've travelled across Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, and the desert was, I can testify, in the late 1880s, sorry, 1880s, that was a Freudian slip, 1980s, stunningly beautiful desert. Absolutely stunningly beautiful, but maybe not so much with these things planted in them in a distinctly challenging thought fashion. But of course, if you put something in a friendly, child adjacent imagery, then everything's fine. It doesn't do any harm, does it? This is the Disney Epcot Centre. Solar panels. This is New Caledonia is an island in the Pacific Ocean. It's a French territory. So maybe this would be called Je t'aime. But it's because obviously it's in a heart shape. You'd have to be a right old misery guts like me to criticise what that does to the local environment. But remember, all these solar storage facilities like this are partaking of the method of storage of energy so that everybody can use their smartphone to the nth degree. The same young people who are obsessed about net zero who can't live 5 minutes without their smartphone, and all the precious metals that have to be mined for that, and on and on and on. But Heidegger's point is this shares the same logic, the same challenging thought logic of technology rather than poesis. It's just absolutely horrible. This is the Mojave Desert, the Riverside East Solar Energy Zone. Stretches for 150,000 acres, making it 10 times the size of Manhattan. The revealing that rules throughout modern technology has the character of a setting upon, in the sense of a challenging forth. Such challenging happens in that the energy concealed in nature is unlocked. What is unlocked is transformed. What is transformed is stored up. What is stored up is in turn distributed, and what is distributed is switched about ever anew. Unlocking, transforming, storing, distributing, and switching about are ways of revealing, but the revealing never simply comes to an end. Neither does it run off into the indeterminate. The revealing reveals to itself its own manifoldly interlocking paths through regulating their course. This regulating itself is, for its part, everywhere secured. Regulating and securing even become the chief characteristics of the revealing that challenges. So in his typically circumlocutory fashion, Heidegger's describing the essence of the logic of technology, examples of which I've shown you, even though it's claiming to be green technology. So before more miserable images, this is another nice Pissarro, the view from the Versailles Road, guess what, from Louvciennes in 1870. So small scale building, loving couple, looking off into the distance. No wind farms there, no solar farms. Unlike here, this is Northumberland in the UK. This is the Braes of Doon near Stirling in Scotland. This is off the coast of Sussex. And what truly depresses me about this is apparently this area is becoming popular for, wait for it, wind turbine tourism. Because these make good pictures on Instagram and TikTok. People, unlike the birds, are flocking to them. How dare you? This is a particularly depressing one. This is Whiteley Wind Farm, and if you look in Scotland, and if you look on the left in the distance, that's the Isle of Arran. So let's take a stunningly beautiful part of the world and do this to it. It's the technological equivalent of throwing tomato soup at a Van Gogh. Whilst claiming you love the planet. These, I don't want to be accused of misrepresenting. This is Polly Hill Wind Farm in Scotland, and I think my understanding is these are publicity images of what they want it to look like or what they will look like, and they call it a community engagement process where they will share images like this. So this is the best it could look according to the promotional pictures from the people who make money from this. You make your own mind up how nice or otherwise it looks. What kind of unconcealment is it then that is peculiar to that which results from this setting upon that challenges? Everywhere, everything is ordered to stand by, to be immediately on hand, indeed to stand there just so that it may be on call for a further ordering. Whatever is ordered about in this way has its own standing. We call it the standing reserve, the Bestand. The word expresses here something more and something more essential than mere stock. The word standing reserve assumes the rank of an inclusive rubric. It designates nothing less than the way in which everything present is that is wrought upon by the revealing that challenges. Whatever stands by in the sense of standing reserve no longer stands over against us as object. So maybe at another time I can do a deep dive into Heidegger if you're not already fed up with him. But he's basically saying that it's this storing and putting things aside to be used in a different form is what technology does. The windmills from the Van Gogh paintings, they don't have any other use. They don't store the energy if the wind's not blowing. It's just a very natural, unassuming, non-challenging interaction of buildings and nature, unlike all the images I've been showing you of wind farms and solar farms. Yet an airliner that stands on the runway is surely an object. Certainly, we can represent the machine so, but then it conceals itself as to what and how it is. Revealed, it stands on the taxi strip only as standing reserve, insomuch as it is ordered to ensure the possibility of transportation. For this it must be in its whole structure, and in every one of its constituent parts itself on call for duty, i.e. ready for takeoff. It's a beautiful example. What Heidegger's showing is, yes, strictly speaking, it's correct to say that a plane on a runway is an object, a technological object. But the truth, this is what I referred to earlier as the distinction between the true and the correct. The ultimate essence, the truth of the airplane is that it's tied in to all the support structures, the airports, the runways, the need for air, diesel, fuel, all the things that go with the roads that lead to the airport. There's a whole infrastructure of which the aircraft is just the final bit of the jigsaw. And we forget the jigsaw because we concentrate on the one piece. So this is all in parentheses in the actual article. Here it would be appropriate to discuss Hegel's definition of the machine as an autonomous tool. When applied to the tools of the craftsman, his characterization is correct. Characterized in this way, however, the machine is not thought at all from the essence of technology within which it belongs. Seen in terms of the standing reserve, the machine is completely unautonomous, for it has its standing only from the ordering of the orderable. So he's basically saying Hegel was trying to argue that individual tools maintain their own independence. But as with the example of the airplane, Heidegger's saying no, they only seem to be autonomous objects. Actually, they're tied up in these complex infrastructures. And by extension, you could argue human beings are caught up in these cultural environments that are underlaid by technology that we don't realise. We don't realise the strip mall bar partakes of a whole infrastructure that sets it against a much more unassuming centuries-old pub. So this is heartbreaking. This is the Shetland Islands and coast of Scotland that used to be stunningly beautiful. This is Burra in South Australia. This is Ramsgate in Kent off the coast. Mojave Desert in California again. From memory, these were taken from an article that was espousing the beauty of wind farms. Would you believe it? Palm Springs, California. Hartlepool. That's the UK for those not familiar with Hartlepool. A Turner painting of the sea, that is not. I I never saw a man who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue which prisoners call the sky, and at every wandering cloud that trailed its ravelled fleeces by. This is returning to the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and some of the stanzas change subtly. So the previous one I quoted at the beginning of the talk, it was about silver sails. This is every wandering cloud that trailed its ravelled fleeces by. And remember, every man kills the thing he loves. And this is from New Zealand. I thought I'd pick up on the fleeces in case you hadn't. The fleeces of the clouds, the fleeces of the lambs, and then the wind turbines. I think when they try and make the wind farms look artistic, it makes it exponentially more depressing. This is La Muela in Spain. So poppies can be quite emotive flowers, but to me, in this picture, they represent the death of everything beautiful. So the last couple of images, Pissarro, this is Sunset, 1872. So this is my argument for what is being lost by sun farms and wind farms. This is the idyllic poesis that Pissarro is representing of Heidegger's idea. However hard and bitter, however hampering and threatening the lack of houses remains, the real plight of dwelling does not lie merely in a lack of houses. The real plight of dwelling is indeed older than the world wars with their destruction, older also than the increase of the earth's population and the condition of the industrial workers. The real dwelling plight lies in this, that mortals ever search anew for the nature of dwelling, that they must ever learn to dwell. What if man's homelessness consisted in this, that man still does not even think of the real plight of dwelling as the plight? Yet as soon as man gives thought to his homelessness, it is a misery no longer. Rightly considered and kept well in mind, it is the sole summons that calls mortals into their dwelling. This is Schöneck in Germany. And I wanted to finish with this image because the notion of dwelling in the previous quote, it just saddens me, give it any chance of survival and nature tries its best. But this is nature trying to survive in the dystopian net zero future. And maybe to be tiny bit optimistic, at the end of the question concerning technology essay, Heidegger quotes his favourite poet. I think his first name is Friedrich, but Hölderlin. And I think the poem's called Patmos, but the line he quotes is, "Where danger is, there grows the saving power also." So that poor little stork trying to build for the future in the middle of a wind turbine farm. Where the danger is, there grows the saving power also. Till the next time, all the very best. Take care.